Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Correspondents Cafe. And I am here with three correspondents and a very well-known television journalist from Portugal. And Fernanda Freitas is going to introduce the rest of the correspondents and have a conversation with them about the life of the international correspondent for the next hour. So take it away, Fernanda.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you all for being there and listening to all these amazing stories in this amazing Storytellers Day. So I will first begin to excuse myself for my bad English. I just hope everybody else understands what I'm saying. But if I make some kind of mistake, please remember I speak Portuguese and then French, English, Italian, and Russian. But for the moment, I'll try to keep up with the most spoken language in the world, bad English. Okay, so I'll introduce our guest speakers. We have Rob Cameron, which is our BBC correspondent in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. He covers politics, society, business, arts, and other subjects for BBC Radio, BBC, and BBC News Online. He was born in London, but he moved to Prague in 1993. He began his radio career in 1999 when he joined Radio Prague, the international service of Czech radio. He then began reporting for BBC in 2001, became BBC full-time Czech and Slovakian correspondent in 2004. He also contributes to other broadcasts, including Germany, Canada, Austria, and Ireland. He has extensive assignments with Czech Republic and a lot of places he will tell us all about, and interviewed a lot of people, since Madeleine Albright, Dalai Lama, and Václav Havel. That's not the way you pronounce it, and you listen to this in a very short moment. Féderike Geerdink, I hope I said it right. It's an independent journalist from the Netherlands with 3 decades of experience. She was a freelance correspondent in Turkey between 2006 and 2015, when Turkey expelled her because of her work on the Kurds. She then headed to the Kurdish mountains to join the PKK for a year to write a book about the armed movement, which has just been published in English, so just Google it, okay? She writes about power structures and those who want to tear them down, also in the Netherlands. Coronavirus allowing, she will be traveling to Kurdistan again soon. She just added Scotland to her journalist travel wish list. I hope she also adds Portugal, okay? Anna Bosch, hola. She's my neighbor. She is a senior correspondent at TVE, Televisión de España, Spanish public broadcaster. She's a former correspondent in Moscow, Washington, and London. She's been covering international affairs for almost 3 decades, focused mainly on Europe and United States. She was part of the team that created Euronews. In Moscow, she covered the end of Yeltsin's years and Putin's first years, the second war in Chechnya, the sinking of submarine Kursk, and the Dubrovka theater hostage crisis. In Washington, George W. Bush's second mandate, the raising of Obama at the White House, the election of Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. So we have 3 amazing storytellers here. And Anna, we can start with you. Just, proximity. You're in Spain right now, I think.
Hello. We can almost touch.
Hola, Vicina. Hola, ¿qué tal? So, Anna, let me start with this very nice story. You were born in Catalonia, so you learned Catalan as a mother language. Even though you were in Spain, and everybody speaks, we hope, Spanish, you learned Spanish to work, in fact, right? So it's nice to start talking about our life with different languages, with a person that had to almost learn a different language in her own country, right, Anna?
Well, the thing is that I'm pretty old, so I still start my education. I mean, I went to school that Franco was still alive. Mm-hmm. That means that Catalan was forbidden. I mean, we spoke it, but it was forbidden to teach it. So I learned Catalan when I was already 14 or 15 years old, and because I was really willing to do that. So I learned how to write it, because we spoke it, but it was not permitted to teach it at school. And then further on, I mean, I started working in the 80s. In the 80s, Franco was happily died. And we have what we call here co-official languages, which means that in Catalonia, for instance, or in the Basque Country, or in Galicia, so close to Portugal. So we have two languages as official language, Spanish for all Spain, and in these different regions, we have our own language, so to say. Mm-hmm. And so I started working in Catalan. And so this was the language, because it was my mother tongue. It was where all, you know, the main phrases, common phrases, and dialectical and the idioms I manage with. And I started working for something like 10 years in only Catalan, because at the time it was when all media, democracy and everything broke up. But then I moved to Madrid to work for a nationwide, a Spain-wide network. And so I had to pass from almost 100% Catalan or 80% Catalan to 100% in Spanish or 95% in Spanish. And so I realized that even if I spoke the language since I was born almost, or since I was some 3 years old, I wasn't that fluent. I mean, at the professional level, you know, we are talking about broadcasting and broadcasting on public TV. And so I realized, so the trick was, as always in any language, just you don't feel 100% confident, was to just squeeze, you know, the range of my vocabulary and just use those expressions and words I felt comfortable with. And bit by bit, step by step, day by day, I was just improving my Spanish. And now it's the other way around, you know, because I spent most of my 30 last years working in Spanish. And from time to time, I have to broadcast in Catalan and write in Catalan. And now, to my astonishment and even some rage, internal rage, I say, oh, I hesitate now in my mother tongue, you know. But I think this is very common, and that anyone that has spent a lot of time in someone else's language or knows very well or works every day in some language different than his or her mother tongue experiences that at one point you hesitate with your own language.
And now I'll go to Rob. Hi, Rob. How's everything there in one of my favorite European cities? Prague is so beautiful city. Everyone should go there and say hi to you, of course. But when we were getting ready we had like this pre-meeting, you told me something very, very nice about learning Czech language and the way you fell in love with the language. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? Hi, Rob.
Yeah, well, good evening and hello. I definitely did fall in love with the language. It's a marvelous language. It's a very difficult language, and Czechs like to boast that it is the most difficult language or one of the most difficult languages in the world after Chinese, they usually say, which is not true. I think all languages are hard. All languages are difficult to speak well, but a few languages have, you know, seven different cases, and few languages are so hard to get right and so easy to get wrong. But I think what we were discussing when we chatted before this evening was the fact that when you do become fluent in a foreign language, it does give you a sense of freedom. It's almost a liberation in a sense. And I found that with Czech. I found that now when I communicate with people in Czech, I feel much freer to express my feelings in Czech than I do in my native tongue of English. And I think that's to do with, you know, the sort of typical British reticence and reserve. When I switch to Czech, I generally tend to say things in Czech that I would never say in English. And that's no longer a question of facility or fluency in a language. It's a question of emotional attachment, I suppose, to the people, the place. I don't know, but it's one of the most curious things that I found about becoming a Czech speaker is the fact that I'm a different person when I speak Czech. When I speak English, I'm way more British and way more sort of reticent. But when I speak Czech, I'll be much more open about my feelings or emotions or anything. And it's very curious. I should also just point out that I have last week found out that I am becoming Czech because I've applied for Czech citizenship. So I'm no longer a Brit you know, dislocated for the last 29 years. In a few weeks, I will be a Czech.
Whoa. Congrats, that's amazing. An amazing story regarding the words. And I will get back to Václav Havel in 1 minute, but I'll just say hi to Féderike. Hello. Hoe maakt u het?
Hello, hello.
The only thing I know how to say Dutch. Everything okay, Féderike? How was your experience talking a different language from your natural language at the beginning?
It turned out when I went to Turkey, I had this sort of vague expectation that if I lived there for a year, I would know the language, which was, of course, totally untrue. By now, my Turkish is okay, but I haven't been using it that much anymore, so it's getting worse. But I also, since I moved to the Kurdish regions in 2012, I started learning Kurdish as well. And that has been even harder, actually, even though Kurdish is in the same language group as Dutch. It's an Indo-European language. So the grammatical structures are also much closer. But due to assimilation of Kurds and suppression of Kurdish language, it's very hard to, even in the capital of Kurdistan in Turkey, Diyarbakir, it's very hard to really practice your Kurdish or to read it on the street. When I lived in Istanbul, you pass all the shops all the time, so you can read and you can learn while you're on the street or on the market. You see all the names of all the fish and vegetables, and that doesn't really happen in Kurdistan. So you can't really, everything is in Turkish there too. So you can't really improve your language beyond the classes that you go to. And that was, that I'm still working on my Kurdish now that I'm in the Netherlands, but yeah, it was very insightful how suppression of a language even affects, you know, foreign language learners.
Well, no, just
so at the beginning, for all of you, yes, Anna, I'll get back to you. With you can answer Féderike, but then with this idea in mind. At the beginning, did you need translators? Was it difficult to work with a translator or through a translator versus now working with the language? Anna, sorry to interrupt you.
No. I mean, I was just going to follow up on what Rob said about his being a different person when he speaks Czech and when he speaks English, is that in Russia, I mean, as you all know, and Rob probably knows better than anyone, I mean, Slavs, people who speak Slavian language, they are very good learners of foreign languages to a point. I mean, at least this is my experience. And to me, it was always amazing how many people who couldn't travel beyond the Soviet Union barriers spoke a perfect Spanish, perfect French, perfect Italian. But the most amazing thing was that they not only manage the language, they learn the way of being, you know, a native of that place. At that time when I was there, I mean, the foreign affairs minister was Igor Ivanov, who had spent some time in Madrid. He spoke a perfect Spanish, but the most astonishing thing is that when he spoke Spanish, he became a Spaniard. You know, he was someone very open, very expansive. He was touching everyone. He was touching me. And, you know, Anna, like we were in a bar. And, you know, I had to keep saying to myself, no, Anna, he's not a friend of yours. He's just the Russian Federation Foreign Affairs Minister. Because, and then at one point at one of these correspondents' dinner, I was in a table and most of the people were speaking French. And it happened that the guy that was close to me, he spoke, I mean, he had this French diplomacy manners, you know, kind of Dominique de Villepin or Michel Barnier now, you know, and I assumed he was French. I really assumed he was French. And when I asked him what exactly he was doing in Moscow, I mean, supposing he worked for the French embassy or for some French company, he said, no, I work here at the ministry. And I said, what ministry? He said, I mean, the Foreign Affairs Ministry. He was Russian. But, you know, the manners, I was convinced that he was a French diplomat, you know, because the way he spoke, even the words and the manners, and this is astonishing. And it was just to follow up, I mean, Rob's point.
Mm-hmm. No, that's amazing. But if you get to, any one of you get to interview our Portuguese president, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, he will hug you. It's just his natural way of being. Well, no, Portuguese. We like to hug, even though we cannot right now regarding coronavirus.
And as for the translator, it's very frustrating working through a translator because you don't feel, it's what Rob was saying, you don't feel free. I mean, it's like you have a corset, you know, you have a sort of, you can be, actually, it's something metaphysical almost. You can never be 100% sure that the people you are interviewing gets what you really want to convey, and that the other way, it works the same, you know, that you are getting exactly what he said. And you feel so insecure. I mean, every time I have to work through translators, I mean, no matter how good they are, I mean, I feel like I don't get it. You know, I don't get it. And when it happens, especially when it happens in countries that are not democracies, because then there's, you know, this fear of the translator to exactly be as brutal or as straight as you are in your questioning. So it's really frustrating.
Yeah.
If I could say, sorry.
Rob,
I remember one of the most excruciating press conferences I ever attended was with Madeleine Albright, who was the obviously Czech-born US Secretary of State, and she's still very fluent in Czech. But she learnt the Czech of, her Czech is the Czech of a 9-year-old girl, because she emigrated from Czechoslovakia just before the war, but she's still fluent. But every time she came back to the Czech Republic, whenever she attended any kind of official function where there would be a press conference, afterwards, she would always do the press conference in English with an interpreter, simply because she said that the level of her Czech, that even though it was fluent, it was still informal and not appropriate for the foreign minister of the United States to be speaking alongside the Czech foreign minister or whatever. But I remember one time, press conference with her, they had a translator, an interpreter, who just wasn't very good. And so Madeleine Albright would say something in English, and then the interpreter would translate it into Czech. And then Madeleine Albright, after each sentence, would say, no, that's not what I said at all. And so that Madeleine Albright was correcting the interpreter's Czech, rightly, because, you know, this was an international context, and it matters, you know, when a statesman like that says something in front of the world's media. You don't want that your words to be misinterpreted and taken the wrong way. But it was an extraordinary thing to watch for all of us, to watch this interpreter being corrected in real time by the person that she was interpreting for.
Féderike, I believe that in Turkey, or even with the Kurds, before you spoke the language, you must have had some kind of, you know, issues.
Yeah, you especially notice the difference when you do start to learn the language. That how carefully you listen and how you try to pick up things. And I worked with one interpreter in Kurdistan who listened to her surroundings in the same way, and she would say, like, I heard this, or I heard that, or you know what she said, you know what he said. But not all of them have that. And I'm now thinking of there was a village in the southeast where I went to because the Turkish army had bombed the civilians and bombed 34 people to death. And there was a commemoration like 2-3 years later. And there was a group from Ankara, from the capital, a women's group was visiting and expressing their condolences. And I always try to stay a little bit longer than the official visit because a lot of interesting things always happen afterwards. And the women visiting brought presents, of course, for the children. That was nice, but also for the women. And they brought clothes. But the clothes were in happy colors. But the women were still in mourning, even after 2-3 years on special days, or many were even always still wearing black. But when they were, when the women's group was there, they expressed, their thank yous and happiness. Oh, how nice that you brought the presents. But as soon as they left, they were sitting like, what is this? Don't they see we're in mourning? And I could hear that they were talking among each other a little bit, but I picked it up. And maybe a translator wouldn't have said that, or would have thought that it was inappropriate to translate that. But it was very crucial for the story because the people from outside the Kurdish regions didn't really understand what the village women were going through. So, and then you notice like, oh, I'm so grateful that I understand these women,
Yeah, and I think that when you learn the language and you became one of them, maybe Rob, you can tell us, for instance, how do you should really say Václav Havel or the tennis player Navratilova?
Yeah.
Because that's one thing. You get not lost in translation. You really make up some words, right? When you don't speak the language.
It's just, I think, a function, again, of how difficult Czech is, and especially in its pronunciation. And that's one of the things that you learn is that let's face it, the very few very well-known Czech people or Czech things that we all associate with this country, like, I almost said Václav Havel there, but like Václav Havel, are pronounced in a different way that you grew up with. And I think the best example of that is the tennis player whom I now have to consciously make an effort to pronounce her name as Martina Navratilova, because that's the name that I heard watching Wimbledon every summer, for 10, 20 years, Martina Navratilova. But Navratilova is not how you say her name. Her name is Martina Navratilova. And also the thing about Martina Navratilova is it's one of the most common Czech names. It's like Smith or something. Well, it's not like Smith, but it's a very common Czech name, like Cooper or something. So it's not an unusual name. And then obviously you have to, when you're on air, when you're reporting or broadcasting, what do you do if there is, and there have not been many, thank God, but if there is a story about Martina Navratilova, and you're doing it for the BBC, especially BBC Radio 4, the domestic radio service of the BBC or domestic TV, do you say it the way that we say it in Britain, which is wrong, or do you say it the right way in Czech, which doesn't mean anything to people? So it's a difficult one. But I would just say, Fernanda, one thing that struck me learning a language as well that perhaps hasn't been mentioned is that in the early days, when you don't speak the language yet, I think you're very much in awe of it, and perhaps a little bit in love with it. And what I do remember, I learned Czech pretty quickly, but what I do remember quite strikingly is that within about 3 or 4 years, I realized that this fantastic, beautiful, mellifluous language of Czech, I just assumed when I was sitting on the tram listening to these sounds, these Czech noises, that they were all talking about Kundera and Havel and literature and the great books and the themes, and having these incredibly intellectual discussions. And I think the biggest moment for any speaker of a foreign language who lives in a country, when you do get that fluency and that proficiency after a few years, when you realize that the people on the tram, in the bus, are not talking about Martina Navratilova, or about Václav Havel, or about Milan Kundera and his latest novel. And in fact, their conversation is, yeah, did you see that, butter at Billa is 23 crowns and it was 24 last week, so it's quite a good bargain. Or you can get, this brand of washing liquid around the corner, much cheaper, way cheaper. Or when you hear the most egregiously racist or offensive things in the language that a few years ago you didn't understand, that's quite a moment, that's quite a light bulb. That's the kind of the scales being lifted from your eyes when you get to the level of proficiency, when you realize that even the most beautiful, mysterious language, when the people speaking it are actually just talking about what they need to get from the shops or saying something that isn't very nice, that's quite a moment, I think.
I have often Turkish names are pronounced wrong all the time as well, and I cannot go along with that because it sounds funny, and to me it sounds also because with Turkish there's a big Turkish-Dutch community, and if they hear me and I pronounce all the Turkish names wrong, it's strange to them. Like, she's living in Turkey, she's a correspondent, but she says Erdogan. It's not Erdogan, it's Erdogan. The G isn't pronounced. Or the city where I lived was Diyarbakir, but many Dutch people say Diyarbakir. That's really not the name of the city. But I would make it explicit in an interview. Like, I know the city as Diyarbakir, but actually you say Diyarbakir. And then you can use Diyarbakir along the way. And you teach something as well. So I would make it explicit. Like the city is Diyarbakir, which is actually Diyarbakir, and then
So Anna, maybe we can, as journalists, we can try at least to teach how to pronounce it right, even though people may forget in 2 or 3 days, but at least you try. But speaking about that, do you think that some way in your life, the knowing the language as a foreign correspondent saved a story, or in Frédérique's case, saved her life? But have you noticed that by learning the language, being a little bit like the locals, saved you from, getting a wrong story or a more sensible story?
Of course. I mean, and first, there's the thing that trust is very important in journalism. Trust. And when you speak the language, there's a direct connection. And so they trust you. And the better you speak the language, the quicker this trust is built. And so it helps a lot. Then if you have a little bit of empathy, with people, I mean, this is the trick, this is the key that opens a story, a real story. I mean, a good, on-the-spot story.
Very true.
Yeah, and Frédérique, you're agreeing with Anna.
Yes, of course, yeah. When I started learning Kurdish and I was in Diyarbakir trying to get in touch with people, some of the elderly people, especially women, don't always speak Turkish. And then if you come in and you greet them in Kurdish and say a few things, then it's already like, especially since the language has been banned for so long and still is to a certain extent, it means something, like she's making an effort to even speak our language that we are even, not always openly able to speak. So yeah, it helps a lot.
And I wanted to add something about this dilemma we in broadcasting, especially because print press doesn't care about it. In broadcasting, the dilemma in between, do I pronounce it the way most people know it among my public, or do I pronounce it the right way, the way I know it's the right one? Because the tricky thing is that if someone knows it, it's kind of, what Frédérique was saying. How can she talk me about that if she doesn't even know how to pronounce the name?
Exactly.
But on the other hand, for people who doesn't know it, you are sort of an snobbish, you know, that you are just there, you know, trying even to fake or to exaggerate the accent.
But that's their problem.
Yeah, I know. So, but it's real, you know. And in Spanish, I mean, because most of Russian names have been translated through English, and have been made global in English. I'm thinking about Khrushchev. I'm thinking about many things, not only in Russia. For my very issue, and that gets me always in trouble, is this this sound that the in Russian, which is a little bit softer than in Dutch. It's softer than in Dutch. It's exactly as in Spain, and we have a letter for that. That is J. J in Spanish. It's pronounced like, you know, the X in the Russian alphabet. But this sound doesn't exist in English. And they kind of made it up with K plus H. What happens? Then people say, for instance, Khrushchev. No, it's not Khrushchev. It's Khrushchev. Because plus was the E with two points. So it's Khrushchev. But if you say Khrushchev, nobody understands who you are talking
Nobody
about.
knows who he is.
And if you say Khrushchev, you know that it's not Khrushchev, or the composer is not Khachaturian, it's Khachaturian. And we have we have the sound, we have the letter. So what do we keep with this K and H? And the same for Khartoum, you know, the African capital. I mean, it's Khartoum, and we have and since we have Féderike here, I mean, the name really makes you really snobbish in Spain if you try to pronounce fan, hoch, or, you know, in the Dutch version, because it's kind of, are you nuts?
What?
You mean
is that a
Van
famous
Gogh?
painter? I never heard of him.
Because in Spain, everybody knows Van Gogh. And if you say Van Gogh, or you try to pronounce it correctly, said, are you crazy? So
who is that?
And it's a dilemma, it's a kind of every time fight.
Yeah. So Rob, we have this dilemma exactly. As a journalist, we should all be very, you know, rigorous, right? Is that the right word? Very strict with to the point. So, but then we have this kind of dilemmas. Nevertheless, the trust issues, for me, it's amazing. I'm glad Féderike talked about it, because that's what I believe as well. If you know at least 2 or 3 words, you get, you know, a little bit of opening. So, and we decided that this our conversation will be the life of International Correspondent, but looking at our main tool, which is the language, right? And so every time you learn a new language, do you feel like, okay, I'm ready to go? I don't know, when you go to other countries, like I told at the beginning, you were correspondent, Bulgaria, Albania. Did you learn anything from how do you say Albanese?
Albanian.
Yeah.
Albanian, well, you know, definitely having a facility in Czech does help in other Slavic countries, but there's a limit, and it really depends on whether the language is West Slav or East Slav. And the second time I had pretty great Czech, and it was of no help at all, or of very little help. It was my approach in Russian was just to speak Czech in a deeper voice and sound more surly and rude, and people did, I think, respond to that, but I mean, it didn't really help me in terms of understanding what they were saying back to me. In Poland, for example, you know, people just assume that Poland and the Czech Republic, being neighboring countries, that fluency in Czech would help you in Polish. Not at all. Not at all. I mean, there are maybe 10% of words that are the same. Everything else is completely different. The pronunciation is all over the place. So it doesn't really help. In the Balkans, it's different. You know, in Croatia, I can understand 50%. In Bulgaria, I can understand 40%. So obviously, then when you go to Albania, then it's a complete different kettle of fish. And I do remember Albania was one of the few countries where I've worked with a fixer translator. And part of the story that I was working on involved us going to the Albanian parliament in Tirana. And we sat in the gallery, in the public gallery of the Albanian parliament, and watched the MPs discussing. And it was so funny because this guy, he was a brilliant translator and fixer with an excellent name. His name was Pandi Skaka. I've never forgotten that. It's 20 years ago. I'll never forget that. But I watched a very animated parliamentary debate going on in front of me in the chamber, and people were getting really, angry and shouting at each other. And after, I think he was quite absorbed in it as well, because he had forgotten to translate, to interpret for me. And so I said, what are they saying? What are they saying? And so he would wait, listen, and then whisper in my ear and say, he is calling him monkey. Then wait for another few words of Albanian and say, he says his mother is horse, And it was just this tirade of very personal insults. But he says his father was born in Barn and things like this, and it was just meaningless.
Those nice words. Yeah.
But they could have been discussing the price of oil or something, and I had no idea.
Mm-hmm. So we have less than 10 minutes, and I think we have time for one or two questions, and we have one from the audience that I would like to share with you. It's from Elizabeth Garner. I don't know where she's watching us. She could be anywhere in the world, but she asks us, have you found that as more people get global news from online sources, that you are able to make references in your reporting that maybe would not have been understood by your audience at the beginning of your careers?
Oh, it's interesting because I don't know, you can't assume too much information anyway. I think it depends. For me, it doesn't really change. It changes with your audience. If I talk on some general Dutch public radio, where people are also interested in or listening to what happens in Argentina and also in America and anywhere, then you have to not assume too much background information. But if I talk to a more specialized program or at a Kurdish program where I sometimes also talk, then of course people know a lot more. So you have to it's more dependent on audience
rather than your sources, maybe.
Yeah, I think you should never. I recently had a conversation for an English language. I was being interviewed about my book for an English language website, but focused on the Kurdish issue, Turkey and other nations in the world that are trying to find their self-determination, so to speak. And it was about the PKK. And afterwards, I thought this audience is very much informed about this topic. But still, it was a little bit, because I was with PKK for a year. And we were talking about things that the general audience maybe didn't know so well. Mm-hmm. So afterwards, I thought maybe we assumed too much ideological knowledge to begin with. So I was a little bit hesitant about the results. So that is mainly what you have to think about. Like, what does your audience already know?
Okay, Rob, do you share these feelings with Féderike?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that my role in the BBC is quite schizophrenic, because we basically, as correspondents based in the field, we supply two arms of the BBC, and one is the domestic news services that only broadcast to British people and native English speakers and Brits in Britain. And then the other is the BBC's global networks, including BBC World News TV and BBC World Service, which obviously broadcasts to the globe. I think the weekly audience is 80 million people or something insane. So you really have to use a different language when you are speaking to those two audiences, and you certainly do make different assumptions about who you're talking to, and that can affect everything that you write, and whether you say this morning and today for a story that's for a British audience, because for them it's this morning, but you can't say this morning when it's a World Service story, because what is this morning?
Australia.
Because there's someone who's going to hear it in Australia and Pakistan and America, etc. And not to mention all the imperial or metric measurements. But also I have found, even though it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's just something that we do, that when we write and deliver pieces, especially radio pieces, I find that the World Service pieces are slower, simply because I'm speaking to an audience, maybe 90% of which does not have English as a native language. Whereas if it's something that is being written and broadcast only for a domestic British audience, then I'll use a different kind of language. It will be more natural to me, perhaps, and slightly faster as well. So yeah, I generally tend to write and to speak with an audience in mind.
Following up again on what Rob was saying, I mean, he has the advantage that the BBC has domestic BBC and BBC World. So he knows perfectly when he's talking to a national audience, so a very British audience, and talking to a global audience. Whereas we in TVE, I mean, which is the Spanish public broadcaster, I mean, Spanish is spoken by something like 400 million native speakers. So, I mean, Latin America is a huge audience for our broadcasting. But what they see is the very same thing we broadcast in Spain. And this makes it very difficult, and with this 24 hours cycle, I mean, with these non-stop news channels, I mean, it's a long time. You can say today, this morning, tomorrow, yesterday. So you start saying this Monday, and things like that, because you never know when someone is watching it or is listening to it. And then in terms of the audience, because in Latin America, there are so many controversial issues, I mean, with Venezuela, Cuba, these kind of places, that whenever you say something about these places or Argentina, or societies that are very controversial, very polarized, now with all this social networking, that there will be hundreds of people against you, just, disputing whatever you say. And so it's really tough, because we don't differentiate. I mean, we have less means than the BBC and the Foreign Office. Yeah. So, it's very tricky, and social networking, I mean, makes it tougher for us, because, it's kind of, that whatever you say, there will be someone saying, but you haven't seen that, but you didn't say, and you didn't mention, and why didn't you? It's kind of,
We're having this kind of bully movement on social network, which is quite hard on us journalists. Well, we're almost at the end of our hour. One last question with a quick answer. How do you cope with the national journalists at the countries you're in or you work with? Rob, at Czech Republic already at all? In a week, a Czech guy, so...
Can you make it a little bit more clear? What do you mean?
Yes, Féderike, I was asking you and Rob and Anna, how do you work with the national journalists of the countries you're going to work at? I think I pronounce it right, Rob. Please correct me if
no, that's right. I mean, very, very well, very closely. it's a tricky one. I mean, I think, in this day and age when everything is on social media and we're all, communicating on Twitter and so on, I guess I do feel a sort of natural inclination to gravitate towards and support, say, my many friends who are working for the national broadcaster in the Czech Republic, Czech TV and Czech Radio. I worked for Czech Radio for 5 years, and I have lots of friends in Czech TV. And as public broadcasters like the BBC, I do feel a great closeness to them. So I'm rather more loyal and perhaps sympathetic to them. And I do cooperate with them and speak to them often, both openly and also just privately. Perhaps I would just say this, for me, it's that whole thing about going local is a bit of a pitfall, I think, to any foreign correspondent. Even though I'm a foreign correspondent, technically, this is my country now, and I've lived here for so long. And when I write about it, I'm writing about my country. But in a sense, that's not what I should be doing, because I'm supposed to be a neutral observer reporting on this country and trying to maintain some kind of professional distance. And the longer you stay in a country, I think the more difficult that gets. But in general, I have a very good working relationship with the Czech media. The only thing is that is a bit worrying, or a bit of a pitfall, is that if you do a big story, or a story that does, make some sort of dent, then what happens is that inevitably it will be translated and it will appear in the Czech media. BBC says this about so and so, and that can get a bit uncomfortable. It's a smallish country, 10 million people, and so if there's a big story that appears on, say, the front page of the BBC News website about the Czech Republic or its politicians or whatever social issue, when that begins to get coverage, it can be a little uncomfortable, because then you become the story, and that's obviously the last thing that you want.
Yeah. Anna, and maybe I start with you and then Féderike to end.
I would say there are two levels. One is a personal level, and at personal level, I mean, it's like everybody, anywhere else, you can get along with people or not. On the professional level, which is cooperating, collaborating, it depends on power, and it depends on how your company is perceived there. So, for instance, I know very well, and I experience it, that in the States or in the UK, Spanish media is worth almost nothing, which means that, it's difficult to get some professional connection or something, because they feel, one, too powerful, and second, too distant from you to just give you any help or any insight. This is completely different, for instance, if we go to Latin America or to small places. There, what I found is that local journalists are very willing to cooperate with you, being your fixers or things like that. And they are really, really helpful. But again, this is a power relationship. They help you if they feel that you can give them more than they give to you, not the other way around.
Yeah. And Féderike?
Yeah, in Turkey, there's a lot of dynamics, of course. There's the media that are totally aligned with the government. And they interviewed me once in Diyarbakir, and they wanted to record it. And then they started asking some questions, and I thought, they're going to edit this, and it's not going to work out very well. So I quit the interview immediately. But there's also more mainstream journalists. The last couple of years, the press freedom has the situation has worsened in Turkey. So I've also met Turkish journalists now in Europe, because they're in exile now. And now it's much easier. Then it makes it easier to talk, because they don't have to be that much careful anymore. And then in the Kurdish regions, it's again different because there are many journalists are part of the Kurdish movement, and they have their alternative media, which are really good media, actually. I've often seen reports of events there that I joined myself, and it turned out they were rather reliable, much more reliable than mainstream media in Turkey. And they are always very willing to help and take you places, and because they're much more intrinsically motivated to bring their story out. And that has been really a pleasure to work with and to learn from, to get inspired by. Yeah.
So, Rob, Anna, and Féderike, 1 hour. I'm so sorry. I wish we could stay at least for another hour in this Storytellers International Day, because it's amazing to hear about your amazing stories. So thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, for having me as host. And I really, really hope we can travel soon to meet and to have a proper coffee. Okay? So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Namaste. Obrigada. Obrigada.
Thank you all so much for that. So that was amazing. It was really, really interesting. And all your points of view and your different experiences, I think, were just fantastic for people to listen to. It goes really well that we had this morning 2 football journalists, international football journalists, who had quite similar and quite different experiences to the 3 of you. And we also had another panel about investigative journalism. And again, really interesting to hear the similarities and differences between your work and their work. And I would just like to thank Fernanda so much for being an absolutely fantastic host. And hopefully at one point we will all meet somewhere in Prague for a beer, like the one that Rob is pretending not to drink, that he has had, that he had before we started. Another beer. So
thank you very much. It was very nice to participate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.